Hey, and welcome back. So what we are going to do today is we've already defined the idea of French masculinity leading up to World War I, and now we're going to look at how World War I will impact this and how the stresses kind of will fall on society and what's kind of going through the minds of the French people as their idea of masculinity is challenged, or and it will be challenged by World War I. All right, so right away we have a large difference from what's going to happen from previous wars to World War One. We're not fighting with a military army that was, these are the soldiers, these are professional soldiers. We have conscription. So what that means is this war is going to be on such a large scale that we have to get all the physical bodies we can into the trenches of World War One in order to continue fighting warfare. If they didn't have the people, they would have not lasted as long and they would have been destroyed because of just the numbers. So this war is going to be different in that it's going to affect more of society than it would have if it had been a war with just a small professional army, their small professional army, and fighting. This is just most of the men that they could spare pushed into warfare as quickly as possible. And so you need to have that kind of idea going into it. And what's going to happen is that the people who are on the front line, who are in the trenches, who are soldiers, and they are, fighting, are going to first kind of get a idea that the people who are not fighting are against them. So this kind of paranoia almost. It's somewhat founded, but the idea that the people at home do not understand what's going on to them. They couldn't possibly understand they don't have our best interests at heart, and this is going to kind of be a shift for society in general, but what we want to just kind of look at is the gender studies. So in this kind of regard, we see two enemies kind of come up from this in the scale of gender. To the soldier's mind, there's the man who didn't become a soldier and women, and those are going to kind of be the enemy of masculinity for them, because these are the men who have to live masculine ideals and face kind of the horror of World War One, and they're the people who stayed home, and they get a name just like the soldiers were the poilus. You have the imbescu, and they are the ones who stayed behind. Now these were kind of seen as not masculine, so if they got out of fighting in the war, they weren't masculine. They're not doing what they should be as men. So really what they should have been is kind of left, they're not men, that's the end of it. But there was this fear that these ones who were left behind would be taking all of the jobs and the women of the ones who were fighting. So the masculine men weren't reaping the masculine rewards. These were the guys who were counter to society, but they were probably the ones, getting all the masculine benefits of being the masculine in society. So an example would be that you have several artworks and paintings depicting of soldiers leaving for war, and the wife would be waving behind them, but in the background there would be the imbescu, the unmasculine man, waiting to take their wives or their girlfriends off while they're at war. And so this is kind of that society was breaking with the contract. This is what masculine is. I'm doing what I'm supposed to, but society's not holding up their end. And then women would also, by necessity or by desire, would be taking the jobs of the men who were fighting. And this is kind of a necessity of World War One. You have to create the goods and services that you need to continue fighting the war. So factory jobs that were masculine would now be taken by feminine people, women, and kind of the idea at first would be, well, of course they'll just give the jobs back. This is just a necessity. But as you'll see, what happens is what women would, they get that taste of the better pay, the jobs, this more independence, and they don't want to fall back into the feminine ideal of what needed to be done. So we kind of had this kind of change of what is gender, and you see it in the soldier's point of view as, well, this is awful, we need this right back to the way it was because we're doing our part and society is betraying us. So we're going to see, to give you an idea, big goal of the soldiers was to get the people back home to realize what was going on. They, if they just knew what World War I was like, then they would understand our plight and we would be back in society where we're supposed to be. And so one of the letters that is published at the time, and this is a translation, of course, in our letters, in our conversations, on leave, we must make them understand, those who still value us and have some regard for our lives, that their stupid negligence threatens to destroy the gains of our 3 years of resistance and sacrifice. And you see this kind of played again in what they write and what they say from the trenches. The soldiers, they're seeing something. This is new. This is horrible. World War I was an innovator of warfare. It had tactics. We have the trenches being used, artillery, machine guns, things that kill on a scale unthinkable for previous wars. And this is a new kind of horrible thing. And they're afraid of coming home. They're obviously afraid of being where they are. This is terrifying warfare. But what you also have is the fear that once they get home, they won't have their masculine role back in society. And you'll see this in books, famous war manuscripts of people who were actually in the war. They fought in Barbusse's La Feu, and in political cartoons and all these things that hopefully you found in your sources that showed that there was a fear of the gender not being able to be in society because society had neglected it in their need to continue the war effort. The masculine, which was supposed to be the soldiers, the poilu, they were also neglected. So this is a horrible kind of fear of the soldiers to have, they have the war that they have to fight, which is awfully horrifying, but what do they have to go home to? Because they don't have their masculine role to fall back on. And so, again, the idea of having offspring was very big. Like, they considered themselves less men than the Germans because the Germans were having more babies. Not actual true figures, but there was the thought in France. And so marriage was very important to the soldiers and being able to procreate. And they are not able to do that because marriage changes in society. Women are given more freedoms, more rights, more pay than they were before because of the jobs they have to fill up. So when we see that come back, when the men do come back, that marriage is a different institution than it was when they left. Women don't necessarily want to get married, and just number-wise, there's going to be a lot of male loss of life taken out because of World War I, and marriage is not going to be the same as it was beforehand. But to the soldiers, there was a clear feeling of betrayal for what marriage was, regardless of whether or not it was 100% factually true. They felt that the women and society back home had given up on the ideals that they had left the war. They had before they left into the war. And what we need to look at now is, that was how society kind of reacted. But what happened to the idea of masculinity? Well, you were still expected to be that brave soldier who went on a charge. And in World War I, if you went bravely running face first into the enemy, you would be hit by artillery, machine guns, poison gas, things that could destroy you and leave nothing behind. And so you'd have to see your friends constantly being destroyed to a level that was not there before in previous wars. So, 1 minute they're there, and 1 second an artillery shell hits, and there's nothing left of them. And you see these accounts in a lot of stories and writings. And the horrors of war are a lot more than what we had seen in previous wars. Now, this will bring us to the point that what's going to happen to the mind of the men, because you have to be that courageous masculine soldier, that poilu, that hairy man. But how can you keep that bravery when you can't sleep because there's constantly artillery shells exploding all the time? There's the constant threat of death in horrible, unimaginable ways. And you're underfed. You don't have the supplies that you need to wage this kind of war. You're in horrible conditions in a hole in the ground. So that fear wasn't meant to be a part of French masculinity. We see that around 1910, if they would interview and write like 20 French intellectuals, most of them would say that they don't have any fears. And if I think one man of 20 said that he had a fear, and it was of the dark. So the very idea of being masculine meant that you had no fears, but how could you not be afraid in these horrible conditions? And so when they get home, they've already feel like they've been betrayed. The women are doing masculine jobs. Marriage is over to them, in their minds at least. Whether or not it is or is not is irrelevant, because the mind believes it to be so. So the change in society will come from this. And then these soldiers who had to live through it, and were obviously very brave because they did, go through World War I, were coming home, and what we see is something emerge in World War I, the post-traumatic stress disorder. They didn't have a name for it yet. And while World War I, we don't see like more people reacting to what would have been post-traumatic stress disorder, but what we see is that the people these fall in lines of what we would expect from warfare. So that this is a normal human response, that, mathematically speaking, this is what we'd expect to see of post-traumatic stress disorder, but we had never seen it before World War I. The numbers of people who are actually in combat didn't allow for this wide of a number to show. So when soldiers would come home and they would be suffering from the post-traumatic stress disorder, from the horrible artillery and the horrible conditions, and they'd have these mental breakdowns, they'd have to go to a doctor who would blame them. They were a coward. If they were not being masculine, they were a coward. And this is not something they can control. So they had the choice to make. Did they go to a doctor, or did they just try and live through it? And, either way, they're branded a coward and not masculine by doctors, or they are in their own minds not masculine. They can hide it from the rest of society, but they can't hide it from themselves, and so that shame is going to push them and cause strain and all kinds of more mental health issues that would occur. So the masculine ideal cannot really survive World War I. There is no way for a man to be that kind of brave soldier in World War I. The conditions are just too severe. And even if they could survive World War I and were very brave and did not have post-traumatic stress disorder, they'd come home and their idea of masculinity was gone, because society had changed while they had left for that 4-year period. Hopefully, they might not have been gone for the full 4 years, but they would be gone for a certain period of time, removed from society with their ideals, and then come back and society has changed around them. And that's kind of what war did to them. They lost their jobs. They did not have the feminine gender, was not the same anymore, and they were not going to fill the same roles that they had before, because they'd been given something new and they stuck with that. So masculinity had severely changed from the man that they needed it to be before World War I, or what they had desired masculinity to be, to what it could be, because you couldn't come back from World War I with that French masculinity intact. So you either stayed at home and you weren't a soldier and you didn't experience the horrors of war, or you went and were a soldier, experienced the horrors of war, and you were changed by it. And there's no way to reconcile your masculinity with what it should have been before. And that's how we end up with that. Some from there, we're going to get your final grade for this, and what we need to do is create an essay. So I'm going to give you 3 questions, and they will be posted online, but essentially what you need to give me is a 3-page paper answering one of the questions and using the sources that you and your classmates have provided. So the ones that you voted on or wrote about, and the ones that you posted yourself, use those to create your essay, use them as the basis, and then write answering the questions that I will have posted. It will be up online soon. Have a great day.